All right, we're going to get started. Hey, everyone. All right, so this talk is about, well, I titled it Writing Good Issues, but it's really about how to use GitHub in a way that is really helpful for yourself and for others, how to collaborate using the GitHub platform. So I want to start by saying we want you to submit good GitHub issues. Yes, you, all of you, even if you've never done it before. And this is what this talk is about. How can you really enter the dialogue of open source by starting to create issues if you've never done it? If you're having a problem with the software, I know it can be very frustrating and tempting to just give up or try something else. But opening an issue is a great way to contribute, whether you're a novice or an experienced programmer, because the developers really need to know how you're using this. So it's actually really helpful for developers. You might think that you're bothering developers by filing issues, but actually it's really valuable for us and for really any developers of open source software. It helps us understand who's using the package. It's kind of crazy because the package can be incredibly successful and useful and used by many people, but often the developers don't even really know who's using their package and what they're using it for. And these issues, like a small trickle of issues is actually really healthy for a package because it helps the developer understand who's actually using it. So this is already really valuable information. How they're using the package. They might be using it in ways that you didn't expect. You can understand maybe you need to change the documentation, or maybe you want to expand the functionality to include the capabilities that people are trying to achieve. How you can improve the package, what needs of your users are currently unmet. All of these ideas, they're really difficult to discern without feedback directly from the users. And the primary way for you to get feedback is through issues. In addition to helping the developers, filing an issue can be really helpful for other users, right? So this provides a place for users to discuss a common problem. This is one of the primary ways that other users can work together to solve a problem. And obviously, it helps you. And it helps you in two key ways. One is you might actually solve the problem, right? If you make the developers aware of your problem, they might actually be able to resolve it for you. But the other way is that it really gets you involved in the open source community. This is one of the most primary ways, I think. If you don't consider yourself really part of the open source community yet, this is the best way to start, is just filing a good issue. So how do you contribute a good issue, right? It can be daunting, I know, because there's it's a whole new platform, and maybe you read issues and you're not really sure exactly what's going on. So this is a guide to teach you how to do this. I'll tell you, when I look at hires for my company and I ask them for their GitHub profile, one of the first things I do is I look at what issues they submitted. And I think that ends up being like a really key indicator of how connected they are and how good they are communicating within the open source world. So to me, this it really means a lot. So first of all, let me talk about GitHub. So GitHub is basically the primary hub of open source software development these days. It provides a surprising amount of free storage and free compute even for open source projects. So it's really, in addition to it just being kind of having a snowball effect of everyone else is using it and therefore it has the social benefits, it also just provides a lot of free resources. So it's a really great platform. It is the primary place where people share code, they share the software, but it also has a lot of other features around it about ticket management, about managing changes to software releases, web hosting, automated testing. It really has a lot of features around software that make that software useful and help connect people within the software development community. I'm not going to go into all of those features. That would be multiple days of training to teach you how to do all of those things, though we do at my company do all of these things, and I think GitHub is a really great platform to do all of these things. It's just outside the scope of this talk. This talk I want to focus primarily on writing issues. But if you're interested in any of these things, I recommend checking out the documentation and YouTube's for GitHub. So a little bit of terminology. Projects inside of GitHub are called repositories, or often called repos for short. They can be owned by individuals or they can be owned by organizations. So an individual can create an organization which then owns repos, or they can own the repos directly. The term issues, issues are basically support tickets. That's the GitHub's term for support tickets. And pull requests, often called PRs, are requests to change code. So often you can't just change the code directly. You have to submit a PR, which then goes through a review process. OK, so let's talk about GitHub issues. It's GitHub's name for support tickets. They are associated with a specific repository, right? So the first thing you have to do is figure out which repository you want to file this ticket under. Anyone can submit an issue. You don't have to be a member of the project or the organization. Usually, the default is that anyone can submit an issue. It is possible to turn this off. And occasionally you'll see that issues are disabled. Usually that's because the repository is, the code is obsolete and no longer maintained. So for projects that you would want to use, it's almost always possible to file an issue. If it's not possible because the developers have disabled it, you should think about using that package. That's not a good sign. Yeah. Again, for me, issues are one of the key indicators of open science savviness. So if for no other reason, if you ever want a future employer to know that you're savvy with open science, being able to write a good issue is really helpful for that. All right, when would you file an issue? You would do it if you have a bug in your code. And a bug can be either a code doesn't run and you see a traceback, that big error message. That's one way that you could have a bug. But also, sometimes code does run, but it runs incorrectly, right? So those are both of those would be considered bugs. If you have a feature request, so if there's something that you think the package should do that it doesn't do, you can file an issue for that. If it's specifically about documentation, maybe something is not as documented as well as it could be, or maybe just even typos in the documentation, you can file an issue for that. You can file an issue just if you have questions about the repository. There are sometimes other platforms where you can ask questions, but it's not a bad place to do it as an issue. The developers should welcome questions as GitHub issues. OK, so before you start writing an issue, here are the steps you need to consider before you even go into it. First of all, if you're having a problem, you would need to identify the library that's causing the issue. Now, this can be a challenge, because almost always when you have an issue, you are dealing with 3 or 4 different libraries working together, right? So here you could have Lindy reading from the Dandy archive, and then you have PyNWB reading it from Lindy, and then maybe you have Pineapple reading it from PyNWB, and then maybe you have Nemos reading it from Pineapple, and it's OK, well, you get an error, which one of those libraries is at fault? And sometimes it's not even clear that one of them even is at fault. Maybe it's just an incompatibility of assumptions between the libraries. So it can be difficult or even impossible to decide what library, in some cases, is the culprit. But just do your best. Just try to find the library. And this is a common mistake, and it's a common issue to not know. I wouldn't even call it a mistake necessarily. So don't be too concerned if you don't know. The other thing you want to do is make sure that you have the latest versions of the libraries. So it's really common that you face an issue and it's already been resolved. It's just that you have an outdated version of the library, or maybe that the solution has been fixed, but it hasn't been released yet. So the way that you release software is on GitHub, it's developed on a branch, and then at some point they cut a release, and that's what you install with pip install. So the first thing I would do is make sure you have the latest version using pip. And then if it's still a problem, and you think maybe they've already fixed it, then you can clone the repository, get the latest development branch, and see if you can reproduce the error with the development branch. This would be following really good practices for making sure if you're new to this and you really want to be careful about not cluttering the space, then you can do this. The third thing you need to do is search the existing issues on the library to see if this has already been reported. And I'd recommend searching 2 or 3 different kind of keywords here, because often people will use different terminology but for the same issue. And if it has been raised, there are little like emojis you can use. So you can give it a thumbs up, or you can leave a comment if you have like a very closely related issue that's not exactly the same. But you can say, oh, yeah, I also ran into this issue with OFIS data, or something like that, right? Again, if it has been raised and you raise it, then you'll probably get a curt message from the developer saying this is a duplicate, linking to the other issue and closing it. But that's fine. Don't feel bad if that happens to you. That's perfectly normal. That's like their job to deduplicate issues, and that shouldn't scare you away. That's not like they're not mad at you. You did the right thing. You tried your best to find the issue, and you didn't find it because maybe you didn't know the terminology, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, I just wanted to link to some of the repositories that might be the one where you would file an issue. So the Dandy website, the Dandy command line interface, the Dandy hub, PyNWB, NeuroSift. These are just quick links for you to understand where these things are on GitHub. Generally, you can easily find any library just using Google and then like the library name and the word GitHub, and you can generally find it. But just as a quick resource for you, these are areas where you might want to go. Okay, so let's say you were able to, you found an issue, some kind of bug in the software. You searched, it hasn't been reported yet. You tried to install the latest dev, still not fixed. Okay, now you actually want to file an issue for this. And I would say the most common type of issue is a bug report. So I'm going to go through that. But you have a very similar protocol for feature requests or questions, right? Okay, so the first thing you want is, before you even create an issue, you need a GitHub account, okay? You can only file issues if you have a GitHub account. I suppose you already all have GitHub accounts because you needed that to get into Dandy. Now, so you can make this GitHub account whatever name you want. And I know some pretty prominent developers that have silly names. So it's not, it is done. It's not, but for me personally, I think of GitHub as an extension of my professional like brand, right? Like, and I think all of you should do the same. Right? Because this is really the way that you're communicating with the whole worldwide developer community. So my GitHub username is Ben Dichter. It's just my name. Like as soon as someone sees that, they know it's me. And so this is like a version of your name is probably a good idea. I had a collaborator whose username was Cowpig, and he was like the founder of a big company. And it's like, okay, I mean. He's kind of known, I guess, as this, but it's just. I think in science, maybe in particular, your name is kind of your brand, and so it's useful to extend it here. I also recommend filling out the bio. Now, this is optional, but for me, when I see an issue on really any library, one of the first things I do, if it's a username I don't recognize, is I go to their profile page and I see who they are, right? So here, I guess if you choose to have a silly username, then at least put your name in your bio. And it's also useful to say what your position is and a brief description of interest, like one sentence. It doesn't. You don't go overboard here, but it's really helpful to understand who's raising this issue. That like one, because it helps me understand how to respond to you, but two, because it helps me understand, like it helps me like know who you are, right? So that if I ever see you at a conference, I'm like, oh yeah. Like we've communicated before. If you don't do this, I've got no clue who you are, and I'm just helping this anonymous person. It's just like, doesn't feel as nice. So if you want your issue to be prioritized, this is one way to help with that. Okay, now you're creating the issue. One thing I like to do is a prefix here. So the very first thing in the title of the issue is a prefix like bug, feature, doc, question, something like that that quickly summarizes the type of issue you're raising. Then a specific and descriptive title, and including key terms like function names or error types or things that are that could help someone really easily identify this in a list of issues as like being the same issue that they had. Really try to avoid vague titles like bug in processing or feature request. It can be tempting sometimes to do this when you're like in the heat of the moment and you just want to get it out, but I would recommend it. It depends a bit, I'll say, on like how integrated you are with the project. If you're just like working as a pair team with someone else and you already have a lot of context, a lot of these rules can be relaxed. But I'm mostly talking about if you're foreign to a project, issuing something for the first time, then really try to make a good title. Here's an example. I'm presenting an example error in spike interface that doesn't exist. I made up this error. So this is no critique of spike interface. I just thought, well, we had a presentation on this, so this is an error that might have occurred. And if you did approach this, how would you try to solve it? Okay, so imagine extract waveform fails if you have multi-segment recording when segments have different sampling rates. So you take two segments, you try to put them together, they have different sampling rates, and then you try to extract waveforms, and then it throws an error, right? So this is the title that I would choose for that. Okay, first thing I would say is set the context. So the first thing I like to do if I don't really know the people is start with a sentence of pleasantries like, "Hi Spike Interface team, thanks for all the work on this fantastic library." That really helps set the tone. Especially if you don't know someone. And honestly, for me, just personally, when I'm, especially if it's a passion project and it's not even part of work, but either way, honestly, it's just nice to know that they appreciate it. It's it will kind of, instead of being willing to help you, I'll be excited to help you if you're expressing gratitude for the work that we do. So then it's helpful to give a one sentence on who you are and what you're doing. I'm a postdoc working on multi-electrode array data analysis, and I've been using spike interface for spike sorting workflows. That's kind of evident here in the issue, but it's not always evident what you're trying to achieve. So it can be useful to add a sentence here to explain that. And then talk about really what specifically you did, the specific steps that you took that led to this error. I'm attempting to extract waveforms from a multi-segment recording where each segment was recorded at a different sampling rate due to equipment changes mid-experiment. I expect extract waveforms to handle this by either resampling internally or providing a clear error message about sampling rate mismatch. Okay. Now we get into the details of reproducing the error. So if you are reporting a bug, if possible, it's really helpful to be able to help to provide as much information as possible about how to reproduce the error. So ideally, you'll produce code that runs completely on its own and produces this error, minimal segment of code. So you'll take whatever code you have that produces the error and you'll pare it down, and you'll try to remove any dependencies on external data or imports of other libraries or anything like that to get the minimal code that gets you to that point, right? That is work that if you don't do that, the developer is going to have to do that, and they're going to be a little bit annoyed that you didn't do it because it's your job for reporting this issue to get to that point. Yeah.
This is pretty challenging. If you're not that familiar with the library.
Yeah, that's true, and that's why I say to the extent possible. Sometimes you don't even know where to start with that, right? And that doesn't mean you shouldn't submit the issue, but if you can, this is the gold standard. That's a good point. And I don't want to, none of this advice is to discourage people who can't do any of these steps. This is just the gold standard for issues. But yeah, you're right. This can take time, right? This is the most time-intensive part, especially if what is often the case is okay, if you were doing spike interface, you're not simulating data. You're not going to be simulating random data. You're going to be ingesting data from files, which means you're going to have references to files that have to exist in order for this to work. That is not ideal. This is I ran into this issue having source files, but I'm going to reproduce the issue using a bit of random data to minimize the external dependencies to make it as easy as possible for the developers to reproduce the issue that I'm having. So yes, non-trivial, absolutely. So including imports and as self-contained as possible. It's also really helpful to report the environment. If you don't report it, the developer, one of the first things they'll often do is ask for it. In particular, the version of Spike interface that you're using, it's nice to say, hey, I tried it with the latest and I tried it with the dev branch. That's the gold standard, and they both have the same issue. It's also helpful to know your Python version, sometimes your operating system or your NumPy version. You can get all this information with pip freeze that just prints out a full stack of all of the packages in your environment, and you can just dump that in. And that that'll satisfy almost all cases. Okay, and then if your bug has a traceback, meaning one of these error messages, please always, if it outputs an error message, this is like one of my biggest pet peeves, and I know that if you don't know, you wouldn't know, but copy and paste the entire traceback into the GitHub issue. I know it looks like junk, it looks like complete gibberish to many of you. And I understand that, and that's perfectly fine. But to developers of the package, this is like super, super important to tell you exactly what the code is doing to get to that point. Even, especially in PyNWB, just because of like nuances of the way that we developed it, our tracebacks can be like hundreds of lines long. And then you're thinking, man, it'd almost be rude to like copy and paste this whole thing into the issue. No, please do it. Because if you don't do it, the first thing we're going to ask you is to copy and paste the entire traceback. Okay. If you've learned one thing from this talk. Okay, and then the expected behavior. You can have just one expected behavior, or you can have multiple options for expected behavior. Here I would expect one of these behaviors. 1, automatic resampling of all segments to a common sampling rate with a warning. 2, a clear error message explaining the sampling rate mismatch and suggested solutions. And 3, options to specify how to handle sampling rate differences. Okay, so I think the gold standard here is to offer 3 possible solutions and then recommend one of them. That shows a level of thoughtfulness. Again, not always possible, not always necessary, not always even a good idea, but that I think is the most commonly good idea. So here I have add automatic resampling, 2, improve error messaging, and 3, add a handle sampling rate mismatch parameter. And then I say my recommendation would be solution number 2 in the short term, and then solution number 3 in a future release. Let me know if you need any additional information or if I can help implementing a fix. So if you do all of these things, then you will make the developer very happy. And you'll be really off on a good foot with filing this issue and be in a good position to enable the developer to solve your issue and to communicate effectively with the rest of the community. I have here some advanced formatting tips for if you're filing an issue. So you can input code. You can use triple ticks to indicate the beginning of a code block, and then triple ticks to indicate the end. If you put the programming language after the initial triple ticks, that will do syntax highlighting. So whenever you have Python code, I like to do this, triple tick, Python. It'll just make it look a little bit nicer. If you have things like a traceback that's 200 lines long and you want to format things in a way where things are expandable, you can do it like this. So you can say details, summary. This will show up as the summary, and then there'll be a little triangle they can click to expand it, and then your content goes here. And you can put whatever you want there. That's something, sometimes I see advanced users using that if they want to provide something, but it's kind of like an aside, and it's actually really long, and it takes away from the point of the issue, but it's also useful information. That can be done. Also, cross-linking issues is a really good idea. So within your issue, linking to other issues. GitHub is intelligent. On the back end, it'll identify that there's a link to another issue. And then on that issue, it'll say this issue is referenced by. So if you do a link from A to B, then GitHub will automatically also create a link from B to A. And you'll kind of create this web of interlinking issues. And that's true within a repo, but it's also true across repos, across organizations. So that's really useful. So if you have one issue in one repository, but it's actually due to some underlying issue in another repository, you can link to it, and then there will be a bidirectional linkage that actually really helps that other library that's maintained by potentially some other different group understand all of the issues that are arising from their issue. Okay, that's really the bulk of it, of what I wanted to teach you about raising issues. I also just want to really encourage you, again, if you're running into issues, to raise them on our repos as a practice, right? Because like this is, I think, part of the training here, and it's also really helpful for us to understand how you're using these libraries and how they can be improved to meet your needs. Any questions? All right.